Cops kill black man's dog, unaware. He is the most lethal Delta Force commander ever. The early morning sun filtered gently through the trees of a peaceful suburban neighborhood. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, creating a quiet harmony that seemed to envelop the entire block. The world was calm, almost too calm for the man walking along the street with his dog. His name was Marcus, a man of average height and build, his once imposing presence now softened by years of civilian life. His days as a top-tier Delta Force commander were long behind him. These days he had traded his military fatigues for the quiet comforts of retirement, spending his mornings with his loyal companion. Titan, a powerful German shepherd, had been by his side through thick and thin. The dog had stood with him in the darkest of moments, through battles and missions that had left scars on both their bodies and their minds. Titan had been more than a pet to Marcus. He was a brother, a confidant, someone who had understood the unspeakable horrors of war without needing words. Marcus had retired from the military in search of peace, something he had longed for after years of combat. But in Titan he had found the last piece of that peace. On this particular morning the world seemed right. The sun shone brightly, the birds chirped, and Titan trotted happily at Marcus's side, his tail wagging. The two of them moved along the sidewalk like they had 1,000 times before. No words spoken, but everything understood. Marcus admired the simple pleasure of these walks, the normality he had fought so hard to achieve after years of violence. Titan, still sprightly and full of energy despite his age, ran ahead for a moment, chasing after something unseen. Marcus chuckled softly, his heart swelling with the quiet love for the dog that had been his constant companion. But then, everything changed. A loud engine broke the serenity of the morning, followed by the screeching sound of tires against the asphalt. Marcus turned his head just in time to see a police car barreling down the street, its siren blaring as it skidded to a halt right in front of him. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their eyes immediately locking onto Marcus and Titan. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. The calm morning was replaced by an unsettling tension. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The officers approached cautiously, their hands hovering near their holsters, their eyes darting between the man and his dog. Marcus instinctively placed himself between the officers and Titan, his protective instincts kicking in. He knew Titan too well to let anyone, especially strangers, get too close to him without reason. Titan, always alert, stood at Marcus's side, his ears perked, sensing the shift in energy. "Sir, we need you to step away from the dog," one officer barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The officer's hand hovered over his gun, his body tense as if ready for a confrontation. Marcus raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, his heart beginning to race. He could see the fear in the officer's eyes, the uncertainty, the suspicion. But he also saw something else, ignorance. The officers had no idea who he was, and they certainly had no idea who Titan was. They didn't know what kind of bond existed between them, how deep and unbreakable it was. "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus replied calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is my dog, and he's not a threat." The officer hesitated for a moment, but then the other officer, a younger man, took a step forward, his hand now firmly gripping his weapon. "I said, step away from the dog," he repeated, his voice wavering slightly as he spoke. But there was no mistaking the authority in his words. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his calmness slowly shifting into a deep sense of foreboding. He had seen fear in the eyes of many men before, men who had been trained to face the worst of combat, and yet there was something different about this moment. This wasn't the fear of battle, it was the fear of the unknown. These officers had no idea who they were dealing with. "Relax," Marcus said, his tone firm but measured. "We're just taking a walk. There's no reason for any of this." Titan growled softly at the officer's advancing movements, but Marcus could feel the dog's body tense. He placed a hand on Titan's head, trying to reassure him. He could tell that Titan was scared. He could feel it in the dog's movements, the way his muscles coiled under the fur. The officers, sensing the tension, didn't back down. One of them took another step forward, his hand now firmly gripping his taser. The situation was escalating, and Marcus could feel it. His instincts, honed over years of military service, kicked in. He was used to making quick decisions under extreme pressure, but this was something he hadn't prepared for. He wasn't in the battlefield anymore. He was just a man in his neighborhood, trying to live a peaceful life. And yet somehow he had become the target of fear and suspicion. "Sir, the first officer said, his voice sharp. "You need to step back now." Marcus didn't move. He couldn't. He was determined to protect Titan. With one hand still on the dog's head, he took a step forward, his body positioned to shield his companion from whatever the officers were planning. But that was the moment the situation exploded. The younger officer, in a sudden burst of panic, raised his weapon. Before Marcus could react, a shot rang out and everything slowed. Time seemed to stop as the bullet struck Titan, the dog yelping in pain as he collapsed to the ground. The sound of Titan's whimper echoed in Marcus's ears, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Marcus's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. In the blink of an eye, his world had been torn apart. His hand trembled as he reached out toward Titan, but the damage had been done. Titan, the dog who had stood by his side through every battle, every hardship, lay motionless on the ground. The officers froze, stunned by the consequences of their actions. One of them reached for his radio, his voice shaking as he called for backup. But Marcus didn't hear him. His world had gone silent. His vision blurred. The only thing he could focus on was Titan, his dog, his brother, lying lifeless in the street. For a moment, Marcus didn't move. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The only thing he could do was kneel beside Titan, cradling the dog's head in his lap, his heart aching with a pain so deep he thought he might suffocate from it. The loss was unbearable, but what hurt more than anything was the fact that Titan had been taken from him, without reason, without cause. As the world around him resumed its chaotic rhythm, Marcus sat in the street, the weight of the loss pressing down on him. The peaceful life he had worked so hard to build was gone. The anger, the grief, the pain, it all swirled inside him, a storm that had no outlet. Titan was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed Titan's death blurred together. The world seemed to move around Marcus in a haze, each moment dragging him deeper into a state of disbelief and sorrow. He sat in his small living room, the silence of the house pressing in on him, the emptiness echoing louder than any noise. Titan's bed lay untouched, a silent testament to the dog who had once filled the house with life, now gone in an instant. His military gear, once neatly stored away in a closet, now sat in front of him. He had not touched it since his retirement, choosing to leave that life behind in favor of something quieter, something more peaceful. But now, as he sat in the stillness, the familiar weight of the gear called to him. The man who had once been a feared and respected commander in the Delta Force was now a shadow of his former self. He had walked away from the brutal world of covert operations, the world that had shaped him into a lethal weapon. But now, as his mind wandered back to the events of that fateful day, his memories of his time in the military rushed back like a flood. The pain of losing Titan was unbearable, but it wasn't just the loss of his dog that cut so deeply. It was the realization that he had no control over the events that had led to this moment. He was powerless, a man who had once controlled life and death with a single command, now reduced to a passive observer. He thought about the missions he had led, missions that had taken him to the darkest corners of the world, where life was cheap and death was always looming. He remembered the faces of men and women, enemies and allies alike, who had crossed his path. Some had died by his hand, others had been saved, but all of them had shaped the man he had become. He had been a commander, a strategist, a leader of men. His decisions had meant the difference between life and death. But none of that mattered now. The world he had once dominated seemed so far away, so distant as if it had never been a part of him. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to push the memories away. But they clung to him, the weight of each one like a stone in his chest. He remembered the sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke, the rush of adrenaline that had surged through him during those life and death moments. The sharp, clear focus he had felt in those times of chaos had been unlike anything he had ever known. But now, in the silence of his home, the clarity of that focus seemed almost foreign. He had left that life behind, choosing instead to find peace. But peace had been shattered, taken from him in the most brutal way imaginable. As he sat there, the minutes turned to hours. His hands trembled, the pain of Titan's loss overwhelming him. It wasn't just that Titan had been his companion. Titan had been the last piece of his humanity. The dog had been the one thing that had kept him grounded, the one thing that had reminded him that not everything in the world was dark and brutal. But now Titan was gone, and with his death a part of Marcus had died as well. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. How could this have happened? How could those officers, those strangers, have taken away the one thing that mattered most to him? The injustice of it all was maddening. Marcus had been trained to handle situations like this, trained to strike back with precision, to eliminate threats with cold efficiency. But he had never imagined a situation like this, never imagined that the world he had fought to protect could be so fragile, so easily shattered. In that moment, something inside him snapped. The grief, the anger, the helplessness, it all coalesced into a single powerful force. He could feel it rising within him, that old familiar feeling, the urge to act, to do something, anything to right this wrong. His mind began to work in familiar patterns, the tactical thoughts that had once been second nature to him returning with a sharp clarity. The plan began to form, slowly at first, but with growing precision. Marcus stood up, his body moving as though on autopilot. He crossed the room to the closet where his military gear was stored. It had been years since he had touched it, but now it felt as if it was calling to him, urging him to return to the life he had left behind. He opened the closet, the familiar sight of his old uniforms and weapons sending a wave of nostalgia through him. But it wasn't the past he was thinking about now. It was the present. The officers who had killed Titan, the people who had taken away the last piece of his soul. His fingers brushed over the smooth, cold surface of his weapon. He hadn't carried a weapon in years, but the weight of it now felt like a necessary comfort. He ran his hand over the hilt of the knife, remembering how many times it had been used, the blood it had once shed. It felt alien now, this tool of war, but at the same time it felt like a part of him, a part of the man he had been, the man he was about to become again. The plan took shape quickly in his mind. He would take down the officers responsible for Titan's death. But it wasn't just about vengeance. It was about justice. It was about making them understand the gravity of what they had done. They would pay for their actions, and they would do so in a way that would make them understand the true cost of taking a life, of taking his family away from him. The anger inside him flared again, and with it came the cold, calculated focus that had made him one of the deadliest men on the planet. He was a soldier, he was a warrior, and though he had tried to leave that life behind, it was clear now that there was no escaping it. The man he had been was still inside him, waiting to be unleashed. He turned his attention to the resources he had at his disposal. His connections from his military days were still strong, though he had tried to sever them when he left the force. But the world of covert operations didn't disappear overnight. There were always people who would help, people who owed him favors, people who respected the work he had done. It was time to call in those favors. It was time to return to the world he had known. Marcus sat down at his desk, the familiar motions of planning coming back to him. He made a list of the officers involved in Titan's death. Their names and faces burned into his memory. The police chief, the officers who had drawn their weapons. He mapped out their weaknesses, the places they frequented, the routines they followed. The plan was simple, efficient, and ruthless. He would make them regret the day they crossed him. But as the plan came together, something else began to rise within him, something he hadn't anticipated. The realization that this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't about righting a wrong done to him. It was about something much bigger than that. It was about standing up to the system that had allowed this to happen, to the corruption that ran through the very institutions that were supposed to protect people like him. He was going to take down the entire system that had failed him. The anger, the grief, the determination. They all fused into a single powerful force. And in that moment, Marcus knew that he wasn't just going to avenge Titan's death. He was going to bring down the entire system that had allowed such injustice to thrive. And as he sat there, planning, his hands steady and his mind clear, he realized that the man he had once been, the man he had left behind, was never truly gone. He had merely been waiting for the right moment to return. And now that moment had come. The air outside had turned heavy, as if it too understood the storm brewing inside Marcus. The days following Titan's death had become a blur, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same. What had begun as a simple tragedy now felt like a full-blown war, a personal battle that only he could fight. The anger, the sorrow, the helplessness, they all consumed him, but now they were becoming something else. They were becoming fuel. Every thought, every heartbeat was now consumed by the singular need for action. He was no longer the quiet man in the neighborhood. He wasn't just the retired soldier trying to live out his last years in peace. He was a man reborn, a man with a purpose. It was almost as if the universe had forced him back into the role he had tried so hard to escape. It was as if it had decided that the world needed him again, needed the man who could make decisions that would change the course of lives. He had been forced back into the fight, but this time it was on his terms. He had tried to push the violence away, but now it surged through him like a living thing, running through his veins, thrumming in his chest. The mission was set in motion, but the choice to act was not made lightly. Marcus stood at his desk, looking down at the plans he had drawn. The names of the officers who had wronged him and his dog laid out in front of him. The meticulous strategies, the escape routes, the contingencies, all were in place. He had never been this organized, this calm, about any mission before. This wasn't just about getting revenge on the men who had killed Titan. This was about something deeper, something more complex. This was about justice, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever suffered at the hands of a broken system. It was about showing the world that there were still people who cared enough to make a difference, who were willing to stand up and fight for what was right. His hands clenched into fists as the memories of Titan's final moments flooded his mind. The sound of the gunshot, the sight of his beloved dog crumpling to the ground, those images would haunt him for the rest of his life. But they also gave him the strength to keep going. He could feel it deep in his chest that the only way to move forward was to take action. Sitting back and waiting would do nothing but destroy him. He had to do something. He had to make them pay. But the decision was not easy. In the past, when faced with a mission, Marcus had acted without hesitation. He had been trained to make life and death decisions in a split second. But this was different. This wasn't a mission for the government. This wasn't a fight against a faceless enemy. This was personal. He wasn't just fighting for a cause. He was fighting for a life, Titan's life, and that made everything more complicated. It was easier to justify his actions when they were for something greater, when the mission had a clear objective. But now the objective was blurred by his emotions, by the pain and the fury that burned inside him. He thought about the man he had been, the man who had led countless soldiers into battle, who had made life and death decisions with a cold, calculated precision. That man had no room for doubt, no time for weakness. But as he stood in his house, surrounded by the quiet remnants of his past life, he found that man harder to access. The man he was now was broken, unsure. He was a man who had loved and lost, a man who had fought for something more than just victory. He had fought for peace. But peace had been taken from him, and so the decision was made. There would be no more hesitation. Marcus was not a soldier anymore. He wasn't just a man with a past. He was a force of nature, and he would make sure the world knew that. The officers who had killed Titan would face justice, his justice. And if the world couldn't handle that, then the world would have to deal with the consequences. He moved swiftly, the decision now clear in his mind. He picked up the phone and dialed the number he had not called in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. The voice belonged to someone who knew him, who had fought beside him in the darkest corners of the world. The man on the other end of the line was someone who owed Marcus a debt, one that Marcus had never called in. "Not until now, it's me," Marcus said, his voice steady but full of purpose. There was a long pause on the other end before the man replied. "Marcus, is everything all right? We haven't heard from you in a while." "I need your help," Marcus said, cutting straight to the point. "I've got a job to do." The man on the other end knew better than to ask questions. He knew Marcus well enough to understand that when he said he needed help, it was serious. And he knew that whatever mission Marcus was about to undertake, it wouldn't be one that could be solved by conventional means. "What's the mission?" the man asked, his tone changing instantly from casual to businesslike. Marcus outlined the plan, detailing the officers involved, their routines, and the resources he would need. The man on the other end didn't hesitate, agreeing immediately to assist in whatever way he could. Within minutes, Marcus had a team on the ground, people he knew he could trust, people who owed him, and people who understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. There would be no mercy. There would be no negotiation. There would only be justice. Marcus hung up the phone and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he had just committed to settle deep into his bones. This was a point of no return. There was no going back. The man who had tried to leave violence behind was now being forced to embrace it again. The peaceful life he had imagined for himself had been torn away, replaced by a new reality, one that demanded action. And as much as he hated to admit it, he knew that the man he had become could no longer run from his past. He walked over to his window, staring out at the quiet neighborhood beyond. The world was still, but he could feel the tension building in the air. Everything had changed. He had changed. The moment of peace he had fought for was gone, replaced by something darker. But as Marcus looked out at the street, he knew he had made the right decision. The injustice had to be answered for, and if he had to be the one to answer it, then so be it. The man who had once led soldiers into battle, the man who had once commanded armies, was back, and he was ready to make them pay. The quiet hum of the night enveloped Marcus as he sat at his desk, his mind racing with thoughts of what needed to be done. The weight of the plan he was about to execute pressed heavily on his shoulders, but there was no turning back now. He had crossed the point of no return, and as much as the idea of what he was about to do unsettled him, there was something else, a fire inside him that had been ignited by loss and injustice. It burned brightly, fueling him with a sense of purpose that drowned out any lingering doubts. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated his map, a collection of police stations, routes, and names, each one carefully marked and outlined. The plan was beginning to take shape, and with every detail he added, the weight of Titan's death became clearer. He wasn't just avenging a dog. He was taking on the corruption and abuse of power that had led to this senseless act of violence. The officers responsible would pay, not just for the death of Titan, but for the countless others who had been crushed under the boot of a broken system. It was time for justice, and Marcus was the one who would bring it. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked to be thrust back into a world of violence and vengeance. But it had found him all the same, a storm that couldn't be ignored, a call to action that demanded an answer. The mission was clear and the target was set. But the question remained, how far would he go? How much of his soul was he willing to sacrifice to ensure that justice was served? Marcus pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. The plan had to be flawless. Every move, every decision needed to be calculated. He didn't have the luxury of failure. He had been a leader once, a commander who had led men into the most dangerous situations imaginable. That experience was invaluable now. The discipline, the precision, he would use everything he had learned to execute this mission. No mistakes. The first step was to identify the officers involved, the ones who had fired the shots that had taken Titan's life. He had their names now, their faces burned into his memory. But the truth was, they weren't the real targets. They were pawns in a much larger game. The real enemy was the system, the one that had allowed them to act with impunity. The system that had failed him, failed Titan, and failed every person who had been wronged by its blind, unyielding hand. The plan would start small, targeting the individuals responsible, isolating them one by one. But as he mapped out the next steps, Marcus realized the truth. It wasn't just about making the officers pay. This was about dismantling the very structure of power that had shielded them. It wasn't enough to strike at the source of the pain. It was time to go further, to burn down the system that had allowed it to thrive in the first place. Marcus paused, letting the full weight of his decision sink in. The officers he had chosen were corrupt, yes, but they were also part of something bigger, and now Marcus would bring it all crashing down. But he would need more than just the resources of his past military life. He needed allies, people who understood the stakes, people who were willing to help him execute the plan. He thought of the contacts he had kept from his military days, the people who had been there with him in the darkest times, people who owed him, and people who respected his work. One by one, he began making the calls, each one building the team he needed to carry out the mission. The first call was the easiest. It was to an old friend, a former intelligence officer who had been involved in some of the most classified operations in the world. Marcus explained the situation in as much detail as was necessary, and without hesitation, his friend agreed to assist. The next few calls were more difficult. These were the people who had their own lives now, their own concerns, and they weren't as quick to jump back into the kind of work that had once defined them. But Marcus was persuasive. He had saved their lives before. He had fought beside them when they had needed it the most. And now it was their turn to return the favor. By the time the phone calls were done, Marcus had assembled a small team. Each person had a specific skill set. Each one brought something vital to the table. There was the tech expert who could hack into police databases, the former sniper who could eliminate threats from a distance, and the logistics specialist who could coordinate everything behind the scenes. Each one had their role to play in the operation, and each one had agreed to help him without question. They understood the gravity of what was at stake. The team would work in the shadows, operating outside the law, outside the reach of the corrupt officers they sought to expose. Marcus would be the one to lead them, the one to make the final decisions. He had always been the leader, the one who had held everything together when chaos threatened to consume it. But this time the stakes were higher. This wasn't just a military operation. This was personal. He stood up from his desk, his muscles aching from the tension that had built up in his body over the last few days. It was time to move. Time to put the plan into motion. There was no more waiting, no more wondering if it was the right thing to do. The path had been chosen and there was no going back. As he walked to the door, his mind raced through the details one last time. The officers' routines, the safe houses, the escape routes. Every move had to be precise. One misstep, one wrong turn, and everything could fall apart. But Marcus was ready. He had trained for moments like this, and now it was time to prove that the man he had been was still very much alive. The man who could take on the world and make it bow. Stepping out into the night, Marcus felt the cool air against his skin, the first breath of fresh air in days. The streets were quiet, the neighborhood still unaware of the storm that was about to hit. But Marcus could feel it, the calm before the chaos, the final moment before everything changed. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about making a statement that would shake the very foundation of the corrupt system that had taken so much from him. The plan had begun. The night felt different now. There was no longer a sense of peace, no quiet acceptance of the world around him. Every step Marcus took, every breath he drew, felt charged with purpose. The calm he had once craved seemed a distant memory, lost beneath the weight of the mission that consumed him. As he moved through the streets of his neighborhood, the once familiar surroundings seemed foreign. His mind was focused entirely on the task ahead, the plan that had taken root inside him and was now growing with a relentless urgency. The team was in place. The pieces of the puzzle were set, and Marcus had already begun to set the wheels in motion. It had started small. A few quiet actions to expose the officers involved in Titan's death, but it would soon escalate. His heart raced as the plan unfolded, each movement bringing him closer to his goal. Every second felt like an eternity, every choice laden with potential consequences. But there was no room for hesitation now. He had crossed the line and there was no turning back. He checked his watch as he reached the car waiting for him at the curb, his fingers briefly brushing against the cold metal. The engine hummed to life as he slid into the driver's seat. It wasn't just the officers responsible for Titan's death that needed to be dealt with. There were others in the system, people who had covered up the crime, who had allowed it to happen. Marcus wasn't going to let any of them escape. He had already tracked their movements, learned their routines, and now it was time to make them feel the consequences of their actions. The streets blurred as Marcus drove, the city lights flashing by, but his mind was elsewhere, on the task at hand, on the moment when everything would change. His plan was simple, but it was brilliant in its execution. The officers, the ones directly responsible, would be isolated, caught off guard when they least expected it. And as for the higher-ups who had shielded them, Marcus knew how to take down the system that had protected them. He didn't need to play by the rules anymore. He didn't need to follow the law. For years he had fought for a system that had failed him. Now he would bring that system to its knees. The first step was already in motion. He had targeted the weakest link in the chain, a young officer who had been involved in the shooting of Titan but had little to lose. It was always the quiet ones, the ones who thought they could stay in the shadows, that made the easiest targets. Marcus knew this well. It wasn't about brute force. It was about strategy, precision. Taking out the weakest link would create a ripple effect, one that would destabilize the entire operation. And when one link in the chain broke, the others would follow. The plan had to be executed with perfection. No room for error. The officer he had targeted was due to be off duty soon, and Marcus had already arranged for his isolation. The officer would never see it coming. He would never know who had set him up, who had used his weaknesses against him. It was exactly how Marcus had operated in his military days, calculated, deliberate, and cold. Marcus pulled the car to a stop a few blocks away from the officer's house. The street was quiet, the night air still. He took a deep breath, focusing his mind, calming the storm inside him. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he surveyed the area, watching for any signs of movement. He had to be patient. Patience was key. The first strike needed to be clean without a trace. The young officer would need to feel the full weight of his actions, but there could be no mistakes. It felt strange, though, standing on the brink of such a significant action. He wasn't the same man he had been before Titan's death. There was something darker inside him now, something that had been unlocked by the senseless violence he had witnessed. But it wasn't just about the loss of Titan. It was about everything that had led to this moment. The betrayal of a system that had promised safety, that had promised justice, only to deliver violence and corruption instead. For a moment, Marcus questioned his path. Was he becoming the very thing he had once fought against? Was he so consumed by his need for vengeance that he was willing to sacrifice everything he had fought for? The old part of him, the part that had once believed in something greater than himself, whispered doubts into his mind. But then he thought of Titan lying in the street, the life fading from his eyes. He thought of the officers who had taken his dog's life, who had done it without remorse. And in that moment, all doubts vanished. The young officer stepped out of his house, unaware of the fate that awaited him. Marcus watched him walk down the driveway, his steps slow and casual, unaware of the storm that was coming. Marcus slipped out of the car, moving with the stealth of a predator, his every movement calculated, his mind locked on the task at hand. As he approached, he felt the adrenaline surge within him. It wasn't fear or excitement, it was focus. The kind of focus he had only ever felt in combat, when every sense was heightened, when every movement counted. The officer was about to make a mistake, one he would never recover from. Marcus's hand moved to the small, concealed weapon he had brought with him. It was time to act. The officer turned toward him, a brief moment of recognition flickering across his face before it was replaced by confusion. He didn't have time to react. With swift, practiced movements, Marcus disarmed him and restrained him, using the same techniques he had perfected in years of military training. The officer struggled for a moment, but it was useless. Marcus was too fast, too strong, and just like that, the officer was neutralized, his fate sealed. Marcus didn't take pleasure in this. He didn't feel the rush of victory that some might have expected. All he felt was the cold satisfaction of having completed the first step. The officer would be dealt with, but there was no joy in it. There was no triumph. Just the grim realization that this was what had to be done. The night was still, the world oblivious to the storm that had just begun. Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The officer would talk and the chain would begin to unravel. The others would feel the pressure soon enough. But the real battle had just begun. The system would not fall easily, and Marcus knew there would be more obstacles ahead. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the mission. Nothing mattered except making them pay for what they had done. As he watched the officer disappear into the darkness, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection. This was it. There was no turning back now. The world would remember his name, and the officers who had taken Titan's life would understand that there were consequences to their actions. This was just the beginning, and as the weight of his decision settled into him, Marcus knew that the fight ahead would demand everything from him. But he was ready. He had nothing left to lose. The days blurred into one another as Marcus moved deeper into his mission. His focus never wavered, each step he took bringing him closer to his goal. The young officer had been the first piece in the puzzle, isolated and neutralized. But Marcus knew it wasn't enough. The system he sought to dismantle was far too entrenched, far too powerful to fall with just one strike. This had never been about simple revenge. It was about something greater, something more profound. It was about confronting the darkness that had taken everything from him, and it was about forcing the world to recognize the cost of that darkness. The moment he had been preparing for had finally arrived. The web of corruption and fear that had protected the officers responsible for Titan's death was beginning to unravel. The quiet whispers in the underbelly of the city had started to turn into something louder. The officers who had once acted with impunity were now becoming wary, feeling the pressure of the unknown, the sense that something was coming for them. They didn't know who he was or what he had become, but they would soon find out. Marcus sat in the shadows of his small, dimly lit room, the walls closing in around him. The weight of his actions, of everything that had happened since Titan's death, pressed heavily on him. His hands, still trembling from the precision of the earlier strike, rested on the table in front of him. His eyes scanned the various documents, the police reports, the names of the officers involved. He had crossed out the names of those already dealt with. They were just the beginning. But now, he was ready for the final confrontation, the one that would not only deliver justice for Titan, but for the countless others who had suffered because of this broken system. It was time to make them see. It was time to make them feel the weight of their mistakes. The hours felt like minutes as the plan unfolded. Marcus's mind was sharp, calculating. Every move, every decision was thought through with cold, unyielding precision. His allies, those who had helped him, were in position, their roles clear. The police chief was the last target, the one who had shielded the others, the one who had made sure that Titan's death was buried beneath layers of lies and corruption. The chief was the head of this snake, and it was time to cut it off. Without him, the system would collapse. Marcus's phone buzzed, the sound sharp and clear in the stillness. He didn't need to check the number, he knew who it was. The tech expert on his team had found something vital. The chief's schedule, his movements for the next few hours, and with that knowledge, the plan shifted into its final phase. Marcus moved quickly, his steps silent as he donned his tactical gear, the weight of his actions settling into the pit of his stomach. This was it. No more hesitation, no more second guessing. He was not the man who had once hoped for peace. He was something else now, something that the system would fear, something that would make them understand the consequences of their abuse of power. The city was alive outside his window, but it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. He moved through the streets like a shadow, blending into the night. His every movement calculated, his every breath steady. He had done this before, many times, in far darker places. But this felt different. This was personal. The chief's car was parked in front of a lavish building in the heart of the city. The lights inside were dim, but the shadows cast long on the pavement. Marcus approached from the rear, his movements quick but controlled. The chief's security was light, too light for someone so powerful. Marcus had anticipated this. The chief believed he was untouchable, and that belief had made him complacent. Marcus moved into position, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. His team was in place, ready to execute their parts. They had been waiting for this moment, just as he had. The plan was simple: corner the chief, expose him, and make him feel the consequences of his actions. But Marcus had no intention of letting the chief walk away unscathed. There would be no mercy, not this time, not after everything. As the chief stepped out of the building, unaware of the danger that was closing in on him, Marcus took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the culmination of everything that had happened since Titan's death. It wasn't just about this one man. It wasn't just about revenge for Titan. It was about something far bigger. It was about showing the world that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the consequences of their actions. Marcus stepped forward, moving silently through the shadows. His team spread out, cutting off the chief's potential escape routes. The moment of confrontation was approaching. The silence of the night grew louder, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to hit. When the chief turned the corner, Marcus was ready. He stepped into the light, his figure emerging from the darkness like a specter. The chief's eyes widened in shock, recognition flashing across his face. But it was too late. There was nowhere to run. "You," the chief said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. "What do you want?" "Who are you?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood there, the weight of his presence undeniable. The chief, for all his power, was nothing in this moment. He had no control, no ability to change what was coming. Marcus had spent years in the shadows, learning how to remain unseen, how to strike without warning. He had hunted enemies across the globe, but this was different. This man had taken something from him, something irreplaceable, and now it was time to take back what had been lost. "I'm the one who makes you face your actions," Marcus said, his voice cold and controlled, his words like a warning. "You've lived behind your walls of power for too long, hiding behind your badge. It ends now." The chief backed away, his eyes flicking to the shadows where Marcus's team waited. The fear was palpable now. For the first time in his life, the chief realized that he was no longer in control. This was Marcus's moment. He had created the conditions for this confrontation, and now the chief had no choice but to face him, to answer for the crimes he had committed. As Marcus stepped closer, the chief's desperation became evident. "You don't know what you're doing. You're just a man, a ghost from the past. You'll never win. The system is too strong." "The system is broken," Marcus replied, his voice unwavering, "and it's time for it to fall." In the blink of an eye, the situation escalated. Marcus's team moved quickly, cutting off any attempt the chief might have made to escape. But this wasn't about physical confrontation. It wasn't about violence, it was about exposure. The chief needed to see, to understand just how far he had gone, how many lives he had destroyed for his own gain. "Your actions have consequences," Marcus said, his words heavy with finality. "And now you will face them." The chief's face twisted in fear as he realized the depth of Marcus's resolve. This wasn't just a fight. It was a reckoning that would expose every dark corner of the system, that had allowed the officers involved in Titan's death to act with impunity. And as Marcus watched the chief crumble under the weight of his own guilt, he knew that this moment, this final confrontation, was the beginning of something bigger than himself. It was the beginning of the end for the corruption that had taken everything from him. The chief had fallen. But Marcus knew this was just the first of many steps. The world would change now, and no one would ever be able to ignore the cost of their actions again. The city felt quieter now, as if the weight of Marcus's actions had begun to settle on its streets. The lights that once seemed so bright, so full of life, now felt distant, like something he no longer belonged to. The final confrontation with the chief had been swift, but the aftermath was far from simple. In the cold silence that followed, Marcus stood in the shadows, his body tense, his mind still sharp with the focus of a man who had just crossed the point of no return. But even as he stood there, the adrenaline still rushing through his veins, something inside him began to stir. A quiet realization that had been building for weeks, perhaps months, now surfaced. The mission had been completed. The corrupt system had been exposed, and the officers responsible for Titan's death were no longer untouchable. But what came next? What was the true cost of this path he had chosen? The questions seemed to echo in his mind, reverberating through his thoughts as the world around him continued to move. Oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. He had fought for so long, driven by rage, by grief, by the need to make them pay. But in the wake of his actions, something darker began to emerge within him. Something he hadn't anticipated. The truth was undeniable. The battle had taken its toll, and it wasn't just on the system he had fought to tear down. It was on him as well. For the first time since Titan's death, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection. He leaned against the cold brick of the building, his fingers curling into his palms, and closed his eyes. The image of Titan lying motionless on the street flashed before him once more. The pain of that moment still cut deep. But there was something else now, a growing emptiness that lingered in the wake of the violence he had unleashed. He had sought justice, but at what cost? What had he sacrificed to make sure the system paid for its crimes? The sound of distant sirens broke through his thoughts, but Marcus didn't move. He knew the consequences of his actions were far from over. There would be investigations, questions, and no doubt a wave of retaliation from those who had once been untouchable. But what would that bring him? More bloodshed? More loss? More revenge? Marcus knew he had become a force to be reckoned with. A man who had turned the tables on a corrupt system. But as the moments passed, a gnawing realization began to sink in. He had become a weapon, a tool of destruction. His need for vengeance had consumed him. And now, as the dust settled, he was left with nothing but the wreckage of what had once been his life. The road to justice had been paved with blood, and now there was nothing but the cold aftermath of it all. He turned away from the street, the silence of the night pressing in on him like a weight. He had spent years as a soldier, fighting in wars far away from home, thinking that each battle, each victory would bring him peace. But peace had always eluded him. Now, standing on the edge of the war he had fought, he couldn't help but wonder, was this what he had really wanted? Was this the man he had hoped to become? The man who had sought revenge for the death of his dog? The man who had torn down the very system he had once fought to protect? Was this redemption? The street stretched out before him, empty and silent, as if waiting for him to make his next move. And yet, for the first time, Marcus didn't know where to go. The mission had been completed. The people responsible for Titan's death had been exposed, and the system had been brought to its knees. But where did that leave him? In the quiet darkness, Marcus allowed himself a long, steady breath, and for the first time since Titan's death, he felt the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him. It wasn't just the violence that had scarred him. It was the realization that in seeking justice he had become something he could barely recognize. His quest for revenge had consumed him, and now as the world around him shifted, he was left with the truth that would be harder to face than any fight he had ever fought. Justice had been served. But at what cost? As he made his way through the streets, the echoes of his past life, of his days in Delta Force, began to feel like ghosts that still haunted him. He had been trained to lead, to fight, to execute missions with cold precision. But what had he learned from all those years? What had he truly gained? The answers eluded him, slipping through his grasp like sand in the wind. He had left that life behind once, seeking something more. He had found solace in Titan, a loyal companion who had shared the weight of his past. But now Titan was gone, taken from him in a senseless act of violence. And in his pursuit of justice, Marcus had found himself trapped in a cycle of destruction he had never intended to be a part of. The path ahead was unclear. The enemy had been defeated, the corrupt officials removed from their positions of power. But now, as Marcus walked alone through the city, he realized that the true battle had never been against the system, it had been against himself. The mission had been completed, but the cost of it weighed heavily on him. What had he become? A soldier? A man of justice? Or a man lost in the shadows of his own vengeance? He stopped at a small park, his eyes falling on the empty bench where he and Titan had once sat, side by side, after their morning walks. He could still feel the warmth of Titan's presence, the bond they had shared. It was the one thing that had kept him grounded, the one thing that had reminded him of who he was before the war, before the violence, before the loss. But now, that was gone too. The wind rustled through the trees, and Marcus closed his eyes, letting the quiet stillness wash over him. He had fought so hard, but what had he really fought for? Was it the justice of the innocent, the eradication of corruption? Or was it simply the need to fill the emptiness left by the loss of something irreplaceable?